During the 1990s, it seemed that everybody had their chance to be an action star, and many people would take this chance and become staples in the genre for years to come, while others would come and go with nary a blip on the box office radar. In this video, I'm going to look back at 10 action movies that would end up being one-hit wonders in the genre for their stars. So let's get into it. What's up out there, everybody? Thank you as always for stopping by the channel. If you are new here, welcome to Movies Never Say Die. I'm Anthony DeJoya, and this is your home for 80s and 90s retro movie content. And today we're diving into some of the one-hit wonders of the action genre. Now, admittedly, a lot of these stars would continue on to have lasting careers, either on the big screen in different genres, or on the straight-to-video market, or on the small screen, but they would steer clear of mainstream action after getting their chance to headline a theatrical action flick on their own. This list is in no particular order, so let's get started. This movie would feature an NFL Hall of Famer in the lead. It's a wilderness-set action thriller that fought fire with fire when Howie Long would star as a smoke jumper and take on a gang of escaped convicts that are using forest fire as a cover for a heist. In 1998's Firestorm, directed by Dean Semler, also starring Scott Glenn, William Forsythe, and Susie Amos. Now, Firestorm was a product of Savoy Pictures and actually intended to be much grander in scale. Stallone had been offered the lead role and accepted for $20 million, but Savoy Pictures would eventually go broke. The film would be in limbo and eventually scaled down, and that's where Howie Long would come in, who was at the time testing the acting waters. He'd just done a small part in Broken Arrow. He had the looks and the physique to be an action star, and I do think he stepped nicely into this movie to bring life to this grounded hero, but the box office was not at all friendly to Firestorm. It would open in the 7th spot with just $3.8 million. Its opening weekend, it would go on to pull in just $8.1 million on a $19 million budget, and despite bringing plenty of macho charm to this fast-moving action thriller, Howie Long would never headline a film again. To me, he really didn't seem that much different than Dwayne Johnson in the Walking Tall film when he first started, but unlike Johnson, Long's rise in Hollywood would stall after this film, but he'll always have his run in Firestorm as an axe-throwing hero. Next up is a tried and true actioner that follows a man mastered in the martial arts of Kenpo that will take on a Los Angeles mobster who killed his friend. This man needs no gun, he needs no knife, and he has no equal. He is Jeff Speakman, and the movie is 1991's The Perfect Weapon, directed by Mark DeSalle, also starring Mako, Mariska Hargitay, James Hong, and Professor Toru Tanaka. Now, Jeff Speakman is another odd case in the action genre. He had all the looks, he had the charm, he had more than enough martial arts skills, and he would deliver his full range as an action lead in The Perfect Weapon. Speakman actually had a multi-picture deal with Paramount. I think they were hoping he could splash onto the action scene with that same level of instant success that Seagal was doing over at Warner Brothers, and admittedly, The Perfect Weapon is a formulaic action thriller, but it is nicely front-loaded with a buffet of violent action, and this movie actually did a decent job at the box office. It hit the number 6 spot with a $3.9 million opening weekend. It would also manage to surpass its $10 million budget to pull in a small profit with a $14.1 million take-home, yet despite the nicely choreographed action and Speakman seemingly having all the skill set needed for the action genre, Seagal at the time was pulling in close to $60 million a movie. So when a change came of regime over at Paramount, Speakman's deal would fall through. A sequel to The Perfect Weapon would never be, and he would sort of live on the video shelves after that. Next up is a movie that centers on the ultimate manhunt where the rules are simple. It's kill or be killed. Jack Mason knows he's going to die someday, but today he's not in the mood when rapper Ice-T would star as a homeless man hired to be hunted by a group of rich assholes in 1994. Surviving the Game, directed by Ernest Dickerson, also starring Rutger Hauer, Charles S. Dutton, John C. McGinley, Gary Busey, and more. Now, Surviving the Game really just came out at the wrong time because I do think this is a solid action thriller, and I do think that Ice-T does a great job in the lead, but the movie just came out too close to hard target and cliffhanger, so it sort of went overlooked. It would land quietly into theaters with a $2.9 million opening weekend to take the number 6 spot, but it would only manage to bring in $7.7 million on a $7.4 million budget. So if you were at all familiar with how the movie industry works on that backside, then you will know this movie took a formidable loss. Regardless, I still think it's a very well shot, fun, on-location mountain thriller, and sure, the villains sort of outshine the screen presence of Ice-T as the action lead, but I still think he commands the hero role well. He delivers a performance you can root for. Ice-T would go on to a still lasting small screen career, and he still pumps out some straight-to-video action flicks from time to time, but he never really got the credit he deserved for his first high-profile action debut. This next action flick would be set in LA's richest city when a group of ex-cons use a chemical spill to pull off a lucrative heist, and it will be up to Ken Wall, starring as football's hottest quarterback that's in for the night of his life in 1991's The Taking of Beverly Hills, directed by Sidney Furie, also starring Robert Davi, Matt Frewer, and Harley Jane Kozak. The Taking of Beverly Hills may feel like a product of the 80s, and that's because it was. This movie would go through production hell and not actually hit theaters for over 2 years after its completion. This was an Orion Pictures project who would go bankrupt during the production of this film, which would leave the movie ultimately in distribution limbo. It would finally get a limited release in the US, but only bring in $580,000 its opening weekend. Its final box office total was just $939,000 on a budget of $19 million, making this movie a massive, colossal financial failure. There was no marketing for this movie, no advertising push for it either. It was on premium cable in no time, which was kind of unheard of at the time. This movie, however, I do say is a good time, and I think the cast overall, led by Ken Wall, is effective for the needs of the film. Wall had been around during the 80s, and this was sort of his push to kind of reinvent himself as a 90s action star, but the studio business just completely undercut this movie before it had a shot, because despite all its familiarities in the genre and Wall being a little bit too much of a meathead, this movie still is a great time. Next up is a superhero action movie based on the Dark Horse Comics character that follows no laws, has no limits, and you never call her babe. She is, of course, Pamela Anderson as Barb Wire from 1996, directed by David Hogan, also starring Adriana Alexander, Tamira Morrison, and Victoria Wow. This is a film that has gone on to be considered somewhat of a cult classic, and it really wasn't intended to make Pamela Anderson a comic book superhero as much as it was intended to use her sex appeal to just sell this wildly over-the-top and silly film that at the time was so heavily panned that the comic book series it was based on would end not long after its release. Barbed Wire would drop into theaters with a $1.8 million opening weekend, but despite a budget of just $9 million, it would only pull in $3.7 million, making it a commercial and critical flop. Thus, the Barbed Wire franchise would never be, but I will say, as bad as this movie is, there's a charming element of camp that does make it enjoyable. Anderson, she can't act for shit, but she really does put the effort into the stunt work, and I can appreciate that, and this movie looks surprisingly good for having such a small budget. There's a stylish visual polish to this movie, and there's no denying its absurdity, but sometimes that's what you want in a quick 98 minutes with a retro movie. This next action thriller is actually based on the same book as Stallone's Cobra. In this one, William Baldwin's a cop on the edge, Cindy Crawford's a woman with a dangerous secret. They've been targeted by the Russian mob, and both of them are fair game from 1995, also starring Steven Burkhardt, Christopher McDonald, and Salma Hayek in a small but amusing role very early in her career. This was another film that really wasn't intended to make William Baldwin an action star, yet it was still his shot to kind of show everybody how he could fit in as one, and the result was a colossal box office bomb. Fair Game would drop reputably into the number 4 spot with a $4.9 million opening weekend, but word of mouth would spread quickly on this movie, and it would only limp out $11.5 million on a whopping $50 million budget. Model Cindy Crawford was heavily panned for her performance, and William Baldwin, who stepped in for Sylvester Stallone, who left the project, does have its moments, but ultimately just delivers too much of a aw shucks demeanor to carry himself as a viable action star. Despite all of that, though, I think Fair Game is certainly one of those they are so bad they're good flicks that are fun to kind of sit back and enjoy because of their flaws. It's filled with action, the pace is swift, and it's just a mindless romp of 90s action cheese that's kind of fun. Next up would be another of those very early 90s movies with a very heavy 80s flavor to it, as a high school kid has the adventure of someone else's life in 1991's If Looks Could Kill, starring Richard Grieco, Linda Hunt, Robert Rees, and Geraldine James, from director William Deere. Now, If Looks Could Kill surely wasn't intended to make Richard Grieco an action star, but it would be his action debut nonetheless. Known as Teen Agent in a lot of countries, this movie would open quietly in the number 11 spot with just a $2.2 million opening weekend. It would go on to earn just $7.8 million on a $12 million budget, making it a considerable box office bomb. And really, I just think this movie is a bit misunderstood. I don't think it really did itself any favors by riding the line too closely between being a knockoff or a spoof of the action genre. However, if you just want to sit back and take this movie in as the latter, then the ride of high energy action comedy If Looks Could Kill provides, I think, is a great time filled with mindless charm and explosive action. It's over the top silly, but the action is still relatively well staged, and Grieco has his moments of likability. He certainly doesn't feel like a high school student, but that's kind of the least of the things you're going to need to overlook when watching this magically ridiculous adventure from the early 90s. This little die-hard knockoff is set in an all-boys academy, and it's a bit of an ensemble piece, but this group of kids who would band together when terrorists take over their school certainly have a leader, and that leader was Sean Astin in 1991's Toy Soldiers, directed by Daniel Petrie Jr., also starring Louis Gossett Jr., Will Wheaton, Keith Coogan, and Andrew Divoff. I will admit that Toy Soldiers wasn't really an attempt to make Sean Astin an action star, and this film really is an ensemble effort that focuses on the teamwork, but Ashton still gets his moments as the action lead. It would open in the number 3 spot with a solid $4.1 million weekend. It would go on to pull on close to $15.1 million with just a $10 million budget, so it was a modest success. This was also a movie that was intended as a standalone, and despite the recycled nature of the plot, it's really an engaging ride that's led effectively by Ashton, who I think was able to kind of step nicely into that teen action star category for a single movie, much like Richard Grieco did with If Looks Could Kill. Ashton is leading this group of kids with a natural command. He's clever, he's brave, and with Ashton's performance, I think you get that sincere human quality as well that just makes this movie such a good time. It's really filled with a lot of likable characters, but when the game hits crunch time, Sean Ashton steps up like a true action star to close this movie out with a satisfying bang. Coming up next is another action movie with a very tried and true premise as a hard-nosed cop takes on the mob. The tagline for this one said it all. The 70s, it was Chuck Norris. The 80s had Steven Seagal. In the 90s, action has a whole new name, Thomas Ian Griffith, in 1991's Excessive Force, directed by John Hess, also starring James Earl Jones, Tony Todd, Lance Henriksen, and Burt Young. Another studio wanting their own cash cow like Warner Brothers had with Steven Seagal, New Line Cinema hoped their new star, Thomas Ian Griffith, could fill that role for their pocketbooks. At the time, Seagal had a deal with Warner Brothers. He was pumping out action movies with $10 to $15 million budgets and bringing in $50 to $60 million for each of them. In comes Excessive Force, a gritty action thriller that's actually much better than its financials and the reviews would lead you to think, but the movie would just never really take off. Its limited release in the States would only bring in $380,000. Its opening weekend, it would just pass $1.1 million on a $13 million budget, making it a financial bomb. Still, there's a lot of delightfully violent action in this movie, and I think Griffith is a pretty good lead. He's a bit stiff, and I can see where he may be just kind of lacking the gravitas of an A-list action star, but nevertheless, Excessive Force was a solid attempt and not as bad as it may seem. Next up is a textbook action movie with a pure 80s genre vibe to it as a cop infiltrates a biker gang, a cop who enforces his own brand of justice. In 1991's Stone Cold, starring Brian Bosworth, Lance Henriksen, and William Forsythe, from director Craig R. Baxley. Despite revolving around a pretty basic plot, I contend that Stone Cold is a good time that certainly feels like a product of the 80s. Sadly though, it just never sparked at the box office. It would just hit the number 5 spot its opening weekend with $2.8 million, and it would just limp out $9.1 million on a $25 million budget, so it was a sizable commercial failure. I do though think that Bosworth is entertaining in this role. He looks the part, he brings plenty of bravado and swagger. This character was originally intended for Arnold, but at the time he was commanding $20 million a movie, so he was out, and in comes Brian Bosworth, the guy who was at a discount, and I think he's capable as the headliner. But as I said, Stone Cold was a flop. I do enjoy it though. It's, to me, like one of those last fun send-offs from the 80s action genre. The Boz ultimately would not turn into the next Arnold. He would though go on to have a reputable career on the straight-to-video market, and he'll always have Stone Cold as his one-hit wonder out in the theaters. And that's it for today, guys. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video talking about some of the one-hit wonders of 90s action. I also want to thank all of you guys once again for your support and helping me get past 10,000 subscribers. It was such a great feeling, and you guys are all the best. And I want you to be on the lookout for my next series coming soon, diving into the lost movies of the 1990s. Volume 1 of that series will be coming right around the corner. I hope to see you guys all there, and until then, movies never say die.
Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?